Please give a big round of applause for Martin.
I think I'm mic'd up. I think I'm good.
Have you clicked it there?
Let's see. So, my name is Martin Wendiggensen, which is an impronounceable last name. It's not so important. I did this project together with a really good friend of mine who's called Benjamin Novak. He's a former New York Times reporter, and he's also a doctoral candidate at Johns Hopkins, like I am. So this talk can be broken down into 4 things that I want you to take away from it. And I formulated them a little bit quippily, but in my defense, LABScon knew what they were getting into when they selected me. So I called them, we'll start by looking at the Hungarian media ecosystem, and this part is called How to Cause an International Incident. Then we'll look at the methodology that we used in this research project, which I called Fishing in High Dimensional Space. We'll look at how our project relates to Russia and how Hungarian content and Hungarian news being pushed into Europe relates to Russia. And I called this one Russian Content Creators, The News Breaks You. And finally, I'm trying to take a step back and look at a broader authoritarian trend that I believe we can see emerging. And this one is dubbed Think Global and Act Local. And it's sort of a hypothesis, right? It's not set in stone, but I'd definitely love to discuss it with you all. Okay, there we go. So my notes went out. If you want to put those back on, that would be lovely. But generally, ever since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been a lot of talk about Russia Today. If you don't know, Russia Today is the propagandistic arm of the Russian state, directly funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the most part. And to be fair, that discussion is based on reality because it has a surprising global reach. So on the right-hand side here, you can see a graph of 21 different countries and the share of audience that Russia Today has within that country. But I'm here to argue today that the focus on Russia Today or these large state-funded news organizations is a little bit misleading. Because ever since the start of the invasion, Russia Today is more like Russia yesterday. Because everywhere where you now have a gray square on top of a country is where Russia Today is blocked in some sort of way. So you either have an outright block of the website, you have an eviction of the local office from the country, you have advertising revenue block, you have all these mechanisms that are used in order to basically cut down Russia Today's reach. And I was pretty enthusiastic about that. I'm originally from Germany. There was a Russia Today office there, and I really loved when they were pushed out of the country. But when Ben and I were conducting a series of interviews with Eastern European government officials, one thing that kept getting back to us was, well, institutional presence is really only one part of the puzzle here. And there's a lot more influence operations going on that don't actually require it, especially those that are conducted through local willing conduits. Which brings us to the question of Hungary, which is an EU member state and a NATO member state, but aligns very, very strongly with Russian narratives. Okay, so how bad is Hungarian coverage of Russia? Well, so bad that if you just translate it and put it out there, it will cause an international incident. So this is a screenshot from a TV outlet called Hír TV, which is a regime-controlled outlet in Hungary. So it's controlled by the government, basically. We'll get into that in a second. And this is a Sunday morning show, a bunch of Hungarian pundits talking about foreign policy. I can never recall their names, but I know all their faces. And one of them is saying, the Crimean Peninsula is as symbolic an issue for Putin as Transylvania is to us. So a little bit of important context here. Ever since the Treaty of Trianon in 1920, Transylvania is no longer part of Hungary. It is part of Romania, which is also an EU member state, also a NATO member state. So this is basically a regime-controlled outlet of one of those EU and NATO member states saying to another, hey, we really think this Putin guy and his annexation of Crimea is a great inspiration for our relationship. And we discovered this relatively early on in our search and just sort of translated it, and Ben tweeted it out there, and it went pretty viral in Eastern Europe. It was picked up by the Romanian press, and the Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs was asked about it in a press conference 2-3 days later, and they were very, very angry, so much so that the next time Orban went to Romania, he was given a démarche about Transylvania. So that happens, but then when you choose to do that, they also don't love that fact, and they will come after you. So this is my friend Benjamin Novak being described as apparently a low-down evil person in Hungary's most popular radio show, radio and podcast, so we actually have the video. And then the other article is a wonderful little piece where they wrote about this tweet by this Ben Novak guy. They didn't know me because Ben didn't tag me or anything, so I'm outing myself as part of this group. But basically, they took a picture and they wrote about this Ben Novak guy, and they tried to dox my friend, basically. And they didn't even just try to dox him. This article says, if you see him on the street, go up to him, ask him why he hates Hungary, try to talk some sense into him. So there's they're taking it one step more. And the reason the picture is blurred here is because they got the wrong guy. There's multiple Ben Novaks, and they got the wrong one. There's just some poor guy. They did correct it. They put in the right picture after a while, after they noticed. And then they changed the article a little bit to make it a little less militant after we threatened them with legal action. But you can go in the Internet Archive, and that chronology is still preserved there. But since they have us talking about Ukraine already, let's dig in a little bit. That's exactly what Ben and I did. We decided to basically collect 100,000 articles written by the main Hungarian newspapers in between January 2020 and June 2022. And due to media centralization, these are all within the reach of the regime. Because in 2018, an entire bunch of oligarchs that over the last couple of years had bought up all the newspapers and all the television stations and all the radio stations transferred about more than 450 of them into a special foundation that is run by Prime Minister Orban's closest advisors. So that's what we focused on. And what we quickly discovered going through it is that there's 3 main narratives that Hungarian media talks about when they talk about Ukraine. They talk about weapons shipments, makes a lot of sense. They talk about sanctions, and then the third one is ethnic minorities, especially Russian and Hungarian ethnic minorities in Ukraine and their supposed mistreatment, which aligns with what Russian media was saying in the beginning of the war in order to justify their invasion. So the first thing we did is we just looked at how much they were saying it over time. So in these 3 graphs, basically all I really need you to focus on, I need you to realize that each point is 1 day in time. So on the x-axis, you have time, and each point is a day. And on the y-axis, you have how often the topic is mentioned. And then you have a blue trend line. And the big purple line is the start of the war. It's the invasion of Ukraine. And so what immediately sticks out is that you have an uptick in these topics even before the start of the war. So you have the Hungarians talking more about weapons shipments, more about sanctions, but probably, or at least to me, most significant, also about ethnic minorities. But you could very well say, well, Martin, that's just what they are writing about. You don't actually know what they're saying, right? What really matters is what sort of narratives they're advancing. And that's true, and that's what we decided to analyze next, obviously. And here I want to go into how we did that, both as an exercise to build trust, but also because what we did with this sort of size of data set would have been unthinkable for researchers with our non-existing budget until even until 3 years ago. This would not have been possible. So we basically used a version of natural language processing that is reliant on word embedding. And what it basically means is we organize the entire text in a multidimensional space where each word is represented by a vector, right? So here I have a little visualization that is supposed to basically show how those vectors then traverse multidimensional space. What I have here is what's called a hypercube. It's basically a 3D visualization of a 4-dimensional object called a tesseract. Right? In reality, we have hundreds of dimensions. This is just a little abstraction to make it more visually appealing, and there's some sample words in there. So once the words are organized in this space, right? Again, traversing the space as vectors is where things become really interesting, because we can look at the angles between those vectors to draw conclusions about the relationships. More specifically, we look at the cosine angles. It's not super relevant. If two vectors are aligned, meaning they are traversing through the multidimensional space in parallel or close to parallel, we can basically conclude that those words frequently or almost always appear in the same contexts. And there's a number of reasons why that might be the case. One is that they are synonyms, another is that they might be antonyms. But basically, we can try to not just form syntactic, like extract linguistic relationships, but we can really extract conceptual relationships. And this goes even deeper once we look into computing the differences between two vectors in order to match logical relationships. So one really popular example for this is if we take my home country of Germany, the vector for Germany traversing through space, and the vector for Berlin. And we look at what the relationship between the two is. So angle and how far they are apart, basically, in multi-dimensional space traversing through. And if we basically calculate the difference between the two, we have a relationship vector that expresses the relationship between these two terms. What we can then do is take that vector and apply it to France. And once we compute it, it will yield Paris, or somewhere very close in the vicinity to Paris, given that our data set is large enough. With this special data set of Hungarian news, we obviously couldn't do that, but we were interested in different sorts of relationships. More specifically, what we were interested in is reducing our multidimensional space to one dimension of interest. So what we were interested in is, what do they actually say about Ukraine? What do they say in terms of positive and negative for each of our 3 topics? What is it that they believe is good? What is it that they believe is bad? And how does that come together to form narratives? So we introduce one dimension of interest with generic seed terms. So good versus bad, excellent versus terrible. So we have these as anchor points, right? And then we collapse all the dimensions until only that one remains, always taking the vector relationships into account until all the words, all statistically relevant words in our data set are organized on that single dimension. To continue with our example of the tesseract, that sort of would look like this, going from a 4-dimensional object to a 3-dimensional one only, then collapsing those in order to then yield a 2-dimensional object and collapsing that until really only a 1 dimension of interest remains. So all the relationships that we had previously calculated in the multidimensional space are reduced to the single dimension, which is defined by our anchor points, which is why we call it semi-supervised machine learning. Yes. And so in practice, this would look like this. So what you see here is which concepts Hungarian news describes as positive and negative. That's on the x-axis, with more negative numbers indicating a more negative polarity, and more positive numbers indicating a more positive polarity. And then on the y-axis, you have a logged measure of frequency, but it's not super relevant. It's more so that the words are spread a little more apart. And obviously, I have met one person here who speaks Hungarian. Hi. But for even those that you don't, you might see that there's like some things that are like pretty positively described from the get-go. Like I don't think the laser pointer thing will work super well, but like if you go over here, you'll see Putin, right, described pretty positively. United States, slightly negatively, sanctions, Brussels, inflation, all described very negatively. And so what that allows us to do is move from individual terms to the aggregate. We basically can, for around each of the topics that we're interested in over the entire database of articles calculate polarity over time. So how the Hungarians are describing these three topics when it comes to Ukraine over time. And what is once again apparent, so in this, the x-axis is time, 2020 to middle of 2022, and then the y-axis is polarity, with again negative numbers indicating more negative polarity, and positive numbers indicating a more positive polarity. And what is directly apparent is like, even in the lead up to the invasion, Hungarian coverage of Ukraine becomes super negative. And I mean, that's true across all three of the topics that we sort of chose to focus on. So it's true for weapons shipments, it's true for sanctions, but most importantly, it's true for ethnic minorities, right? Again, the very narrative the Russians used to justify their war. But now we sort of have a problem, right? It's like, where's this coming from? I keep saying that these narratives align with Russia. Well, can we actually prove that? So the next thing we did is, if you think about it, narratives are only concepts aligned in a logical order in order to tell a story, right? So you can take a narrative apart into individual concepts. Most importantly, you can break it down into into the concept of which it consists and analyze the relationships mathematically. So what we have here is basically a visualization of the minority narrative pushed in Hungarian media. And what you can see there already, again, is over here, for example, I don't know if it's like, my hand is too shaky. You have the Hungarians talking about Ukrainian intelligence and linking them to war crimes when it comes to minorities. You have the issue of Transcarpathia, which is another territory that Hungary claims that is actually owned by a neighbor, linked to minorities, right? You can deconstruct this narrative and basically see that the terms in there that we would expect. But what then did is, with the help of the German Marshall Fund, who run a project in this, we collected a really large data set of Russian news. And we broke that one down in the same way. And we found that when it comes to the coverage of Ukraine, there's like the narratives align. There's like, I think it's 83% of the narratives are, so we have to account for some permutations, and the math here gets more complicated than I have time for, I fear. But the narratives align thematically, both in the concepts that they invoke and how they line up those concepts to tell a story. But that leaves us with a sort of chicken and egg problem, right? If they align, who said it first? And this is going to be the most simple timeline you saw today. We were able to prove that for the cases in which they align, almost 90% of them started in Russia and then moved to Hungary. That's the story here, right? They start in Hungary, they start in Russia, they move to Hungary, and then the Hungarians modify them a bit, like put in some stuff there that will rile up the locals, like they know them better, but this is the simplest. And then this is a Granger causality, so it's like statistically solid. So Russia is an important content creator in Hungarian news, but sadly, it's even more than that. And this is where we come to the news breaks you. This is an image of a firebombing, one of two firebombings, of a Hungarian cultural center in Ukraine in 2018. And it was picked up very widely by Hungarian news and discussed as evidence of the growing hatred for minorities in Ukraine. We see some mentions of Nazism there already in 2018. And both the Hungarian and the Russian news really picked it up. They really pushed this. The only problem with that narrative is that we are very confident that it was orchestrated by Russia, because the lead conspirator that law enforcement and intelligence agencies were able to identify comes from Transnistria, which is not a real place. It's actually a territory of Moldova that is basically occupied by Russian troops. It's such a fake country that they have like plastic coins. When Ben and I jam, we like use their coins as guitar picks. And So the member, basically member for Russian occupied territory, then Polish right-wing groups, Ukrainian mercenaries, and the far-right congressional staffer, which, as a German, that really pissed me off, and we really wanted to trace him down. This was 2018. I was also with the German government at the time. And the Germans actually got a warrant for him and tracked him down in Russia where he lived, but the day after we delivered the warrant to the Russians, they told us he had died of a heart attack. So, on that very day. So, I can't comment further than that, although Lord knows I would want to. But the basic takeaway here is, this is not just Russian news moving into Hungary. This is actually Russia going out into the world and creating news events that are real, but that are also really terrible. And I have more examples of this that I don't have time to cover, unfortunately. So, but what we saw here is the sort of emergence of right-wing European networks that the Russians are taking advantage of in order to further their goals. And so the next step for us, and what we are currently engaged in a follow-up project we call Black Magic 2, is following these sort of friendships into Poland, into America, and into Germany. And we are expanding our collection abilities for that, covering not just newspapers, but we've also transcribed now over 8,000 hours of television, radio, and YouTube broadcasts. That's almost 60 million tokens so far, and we're going and in a wider variety of target countries. Because when we take a step back, this growing reliance on local groups might fit with a larger pattern that I want to hypothesize here and that I would love to chat with you guys about once the talk is done. Because there's a sort of shift away from the centralized content factories of the 2016s, right, of the elections, towards a greater reliance on local groups, where support for Russia has almost become a political signifier, a signifier of identity, especially on the far right, but also on the extreme left. And this fits with what we saw during the Cold War and where we got the name for our project, Black Magic, because there's a quote by a GRU defector called Major Stanislav Levchenko, who said after defecting to the West that few people who understand the reality of the Soviet Union will knowingly support it or its policies. So by active measures, the KGB distorts or inverts reality. The trick is to make people support Soviet policy unwittingly by convincing them that they are supporting something else. Everybody is in support of peace, so the KGB plans and coordinates campaigns to persuade the public that whatever America does furthers war, and that whatever the Soviet Union does furthers peace. And if you look at this little image from what's called a peace march in Germany, uniting the very far left and very far right, and the same happening in France, there's a sort of hijacking of ideals that, at least in terms of active measures, is, for me, reminiscent of the Cold War. So with that, I have this little last slide, which just articulates this hypothesis a little further and just gives you grounds to come and talk to me. I'm also seeing this trend in my research I do on China. That's yet unpublished, but I'm really happy to discuss it. And yeah, just come find me, talk to me. I would love to talk to you all, and thank you for listening.
Amazing.